All right. I know we usually give a little bit of a buffer, but I do have another meeting at 7 o'clock, and this topic does require a lot of territory to cover. We're going to begin talking about keeping kosher, about what is called kashrut. Now, this is a many different aspect mitzvah. It's not just one simple thing, and we're going to take it apart in pieces eventually. We're going to start by looking at why we keep kosher. But I just want to start off with a few housekeeping type things. I want to point out that if you really want to learn more about the details of kosher laws, then please join me for the Mishnah class that is running on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m., where we are looking at Masechet Chulin, which goes into a lot more depth than we will be able to do in this course. Also, of course, if you ever have questions, please be in touch. Don't hesitate. I'm happy to answer questions and give a lot more of the specifics as needed. Secondly, we will not be having class next Thursday. My family is going to be sitting Shiva during that time for my wife's father-in-law who passed away. And so we will not be able to hold the class. That goes for my regular classes next week as well. But that means we will have a 2-week break before the next class for Pathway to Judaism. With that as our beginning, let's go ahead and get to work. So, come on, there we go. It's going to be funny again for me. So like I mentioned before, we are talking about kashrut. And kashrut is something that seems very complicated. But before we get to the complicated do's and don'ts, which actually aren't that complicated, we need to talk about why we are doing it in the first place. The simplest explanation is given in the Torah itself in Vayikra 11, Leviticus 11. I am the Lord your God. Sanctify yourself and be holy, for I am holy. For I am the Lord that brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the introduction to one of the chapters and sections of the Torah that contains the majority of kosher legislation. It is spread throughout, but this is a large portion of it. And the implication seems very direct, that by following the commandments, and in particular by following the laws of kashrut, we shouldn't think of ourselves as just changing our diet or our nutrition or eating behaviors, but that we are engaged in a holy act, that we are engaged in a behavior that sanctifies ourselves and our lives. Now, hopefully you don't find that explanation entirely self-sufficient, meaning that it's nice to have it as a general category, a general description. Sanctification, holiness is wonderful, but what does that actually mean? And how does that actually get accomplished? And so we have more explanations to discuss. But first, we have the general explanation that we should always have in the back of our mind whenever we begin to investigate why we are performing given commandments. And that is because it is a commandment. Taken from the Mishnah Torah, it is correct for a person to investigate the laws of the Holy Torah and to know their purpose to the best of his abilities. If he does not find a reason or purpose in something, it should not be light in his eyes. He should not reject the commandment because he does not know their reasons, and he should not attribute false ideas to God or think about them as profane matters. So what Rambam is trying to tell us is that, yes, we should be investigating, we should be seeking, we should always be trying to understand why the commandments were given and what purpose is within them. But should we not be completely satisfied or inspired by the different explanations for a given commandment? That doesn't mean we don't do it. And it doesn't mean we treat it with neglect or as though it were trivial. Just because we cannot divine the purpose does not mean there isn't a divine purpose. So bear that in mind as we go through the brief survey of different explanations. If you don't find one that grabs you, that's okay. That just means we need more study and time together. But that doesn't mean that we ignore kashrut. So the first explanation comes from Abarbanel, and he is trying to explain that keeping kosher is good for us, but in a very particular way. God forbid, he writes, that I should believe that the reason for forbidden foods is medicinal. For were it so, the book of God's law would be in the same class as any of the minor brief medical books. Right? So how could we possibly imagine that God gave us the rules for keeping kosher just to keep our body healthy? That would make God's work trivial. Still important, of course, nothing to scoff at, to have good nutritional guidelines. They are important for having a good working body, and that is something that Judaism values. But surely we do not need God's revelation to know how much we should be eating in a day and what is healthy and what is not. That does not require God to give us the gift of revelation through prophecy. Furthermore, our own eyes see that people who eat pork and insects and such are well and alive and healthy at this very day. Right? If you did think that the laws regarding kashrut were just about the health of the human body, then it doesn't make sense, because we see people who do not keep kosher and who are not obligated to if they're not Jewish, living a perfectly fine and healthy life. Moreover, there are dangerous animals and poisonous herbs which are not mentioned at all in the Torah. Right? If God was going to give us a guidebook to make sure we ate things that were healthy and avoided things that were not, there are a lot of other things that God could have mentioned, both that we could have been healthier by eating or avoiding, as well as things that are just flat out dangerous. And that might have been very helpful, but that wasn't the purpose of what God gave to us at Sinai. Instead, all of which points to the conclusion that the law of God did not come to heal bodies and seek their material welfare, but to seek the health of the soul and cure its illnesses. But God is not giving us the rules and the mitzvot just to make our body healthy and fit, but to make our spirit healthy and fit. And that means the laws of kashrut are operating upon us in a more spiritual way. Again, going back to the idea of sanctity and holiness, that it creates a different mode of living that allows holiness and sanctity to be more easily attained. Additionally, or alternatively, depending upon how you wish to discuss it, Rambam says in his Guide for the Perplexed, in general, every commandment of the 613 commandments either imparts to us a true philosophy, eradicates a false philosophy, enforces a rule of social justice, nullifies injustice, bestows noble character traits, or warns against evil character traits. Meaning that you can generally expect that any given mitzvah will do at least one of these things. Oftentimes they are doing multiple of these things. And so when we sit down to eat, or when we are shopping and making our purchases, we should consider how keeping kosher helps us to have a true philosophy, certainly by reinforcing our understanding of God as a commander that is interested in giving us our rules, as well as in enforcing rules of social justice, for indeed there is much that is just and right in both the treatment of animals as well as ourselves when we are engaged in kashrut. We know that it nullifies injustice so that we are not causing animals undue suffering or misery. We know as well that through the keeping of kashrut, we are reinforcing noble character traits by forcing ourselves to be compassionate, by forcing ourselves to have discipline, by forcing ourselves to consider the sanctity of life itself and many other things. And we know that it warns against evil traits, that we do not see our life merely as one of hedonistic self-satisfaction, that we do not shove things into our face unthinkingly and without consideration of where they came from, or indeed how our life is being carried out. And of course, that it avoids us being focused solely on the material. And that's just a brief survey of some of the different ways the different commandments of kashrut help guide our life according to these things. Really, kashrut, as being such a broad and complicated set of commandments, has a huge impact on how we live and has been very important in both creating and maintaining Jewish community, as well as Jewish belief and a sense of Jewish spirit. So I think Rambam is giving us a very good set of guidelines for analyzing any commandments, but kashrut will hit all of these in one of its forms or another. Ramban, that is to say Nachmanides, has a slightly different take. And he wants to focus on not the general rule of Kashrut, but some of these specifics that are involved. So he says here in his commentary on the Torah, the blood is the nephesh, meaning the spirit of the animal, in which we find its natural instincts. Therefore, we are forbidden to mix animal blood with our blood, for we received the Torah, meaning we are as far from an animal as a creature can be. For us, our lives have to remain untainted from the lower elements, so that we can better comprehend higher concepts. We are commanded to be merciful, but if we were to eat blood, our souls would become closer to the animals, and it would create coarseness and cruelty. Unlike parts of the meat, the blood is not simply digested by the body, but remains as is, and thereby affects the very essence of a person. This is a meaning of the verse, for the nephesh of the flesh is in the blood. Now, Ramban may have been thinking of science of his day, which believed that the blood was simply absorbed into our own bloodstream. We know that to be false. But regardless of whether he was trying to rely upon the science of his day or rely upon a particular mystical understanding of the human soul and animal nature, what we can say is that those who eat the blood and do so in a way that neglects to be respectful of the life that is taken will indeed become coarser and crueler. Those that engage in blood sport or engage in the slaughter of animals without thought to its kindness are more likely to be unkind to their fellow human beings as well. We don't necessarily have to ascribe to either his scientific or even his mystical view to still see that what he is trying to teach here is very true and insightful. Again, another reason why in this particular example, we would not be eating the blood, which is an aspect of kashrut, as we will see in more detail. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch from the 1800s also saw kashrut as shaping our mission, not quite in the same physiological or mystical sense, but in terms of shaping how we perceive our role in the world. Just as the external temple, which represents your holy mission, and to which you should sanctify yourself, becomes desecrated by impurity, so are these few foods impure and unfit for your spirit, as far as they are, all of them, the living place of activity for your own being, which is summoned unto holiness. If you have eaten them, meaning food that is not kosher, not only touched, but absorbed them into your system, the difference between eating and merely touching, you may be more nourished and better fed. You have calories in you, but the animal instinct will be aroused more strongly within you, and your body becomes more blunted as an instrument of the spirit. That there is a palpable change that comes over us when we are deliberately ignoring the rules of kashrut and deliberately eating things that we know God has said we should not be eating, that allows us to feel more, animalistic, and at the very least, more distant from God. Indeed, every act of rebellion, every act of neglect is one that puts distance between us and God. And as we eat 3 times a day, more or less, give or take a few snacks, that means that this is one of the most constant sources of opportunity to either draw close or to drift further from God. As he goes on to say, your heart, instead of being holy, instead of only striving for holiness, namely your sublimity over everything animal-like, your heart is drawn down to the animal, or becomes the more apathetic and dulled. Your spirit is now faced with a fiercer battle, and is less equipped for the fight. So what he is trying to say is that by engaging over and over again in the eating of something not kosher, you are weakening your spirit, your will, your discipline, call it what you will, that is necessary for the continued drive towards holiness and a continued drive towards sanctity. The more you give in, the easier it is to give in next time. The more you strengthen your resolve by maintaining the rules of kashrut in this example, and all other commandments as well, the more strength you will have to maintain the law and God's spirit when you are more sorely challenged in other circumstances. Okay, so let me just, sorry, thought I saw something over, just a welcome on the YouTube. Now, there's another example of why we keep the laws of Kashrut, and that is from the Guide for Perplexed, which is that by keeping the laws of Kashrut, we are not imitating the behavior of other idolaters. And know that blood was very unclean in the eyes of Zaba, which apparently was a type of idolatry at that time. Yet they ate from the blood nevertheless, believing that it was the food of the spirits. Indeed, many cultures have often said that blood is the place that contains the spirit of an animal. And as such, they often will try to eat it as part of their rituals. Yet, as you said, that was the blood of the food of the spirits. When one ate it, he was symbolically joining the spirits and would be able to tell the future. Obviously, then, in the example of not eating blood, we would be well advised to not eat it, not only for the reasons already mentioned, but also because were we to eat it, it would put us in concert, it would put us in imitation of the behavior of many of the idol worshippers around us in those days. However, there are some other reasons which are definitely not the reason that we keep kosher, but you may have heard of these at different times. For example, we don't keep kosher just because our ancestors didn't know how to cook pork. People did know how to cook pork to avoid trichinosis, a disease that comes from worms in pig flesh, and it is perfectly possible to eat it and remain healthy. So that was not why we didn't eat pork. Of course, that's also because many of the other types of food weren't pork. We also don't eat camel, we also don't eat horse, we don't eat rabbit, and those do not have the same danger of trichinosis. It's also not because we didn't know how to eat shellfish safely. Yes, many of the things that come from the ocean that are prohibited by Kashrut are what we would generally classify as shellfish, but that doesn't mean that God told us not to eat shellfish just because they could be dangerous at certain times of the year. Instead, we are told not to eat shellfish for all of the other reasons that we have already described, that it is part of a system that allows us to sanctify our life. Kashrut is similarly, then, not a system of superstition. It is not because it gives us bad luck or good luck. It is not because it angers God and will bring down curses, or because it placates God, which will cause God to shower us with blessings. That is idolatrous thinking. God gave us the commandments so that we would be reshaped by them, not just so that we could earn God's favor in this way. Of course, God would like us to keep the commandments, but for our sake, the same way that a parent might make sure their children are brushing their teeth, not because it makes the parent happy in and of itself, but because they know that their child will have a better life by having brushed their teeth. And I should also say, we don't keep kosher just because tradition. No. Now, small caveat there. Yes, some people do keep kosher simply because they were raised to keep kosher and they cannot imagine not keeping kosher. And, as religious and spiritual inertia goes, at least you're pointed in the right direction. However, that is not the explanation of why we have kept kashrut for a few thousand years. That kind of following of tradition without any understanding or feeling of participating in a greater spiritual activity would have faded out many, many centuries ago, if not thousands of years ago, if it had not been constantly reinforced by personal feelings of meaning, worth, and spirituality through the acts of keeping kosher. So tradition is not enough to keep kashrut going indefinitely. It's certainly enough to keep it going through some challenges or through some different transition times, but we should always be looking deeper and be gaining more from keeping kosher than merely the satisfaction of keeping tradition. All right, now we're going to look at the general rules of kashrut, but before we do, I just want to check and see if there are any questions.
I'm good.
Okay, so looking here at the page, I should point out these basic 5 points, if you understand the details of them, are really the core to keeping kosher. And yes, that means that if you understand all the details, which are not on the page, but at least understand these 5 basic ideas that you will be well on the way to living a kosher life and reaping that benefit. So let's take them in order. Part 1, eat only beasts with cloven hooves that chew their cud after they have been properly slaughtered, had their blood drained, and certain fats in the sciatic nerve removed. We'll look at exactly which beasts count, but cloven hooves are the foot for the animal, and it has to be in 2 parts all the way through. Chewing their cud means that this is an animal that is a ruminant, meaning that when it chews, it will swallow into one stomach, bring it back up for additional chewing, and move through the digestive system over and over like that. There has to be a proper slaughter, and the blood has to be removed, which we'll talk about. And when butchered, when the body is then cut into the pieces, certain fats and certain parts of the leg, called the sciatic nerve, will have to be removed. And we'll go through all of this in more detail. 2, any bird not on the Torah's short list of forbidden ones is fine after a proper slaughter and preparation. So again, there is a list of birds in the Torah that we cannot eat, and that means that birds not on the list are okay, but they do also have to be properly killed, and they also have to be properly prepared. 3, fish, meaning anything from the ocean, fish with fins and scales, and some locusts are fine just as they are, meaning they don't need additional slaughter or preparation. They are ready to go once you have gathered them in. 4, plants and minerals of all type are acceptable. So yes, you can eat any plant that is not poisonous or bad for you, and you can eat any mineral. So, your salt is perfectly fine. It's often a misunderstanding when people see the kosher salt in the supermarket. People will think that only that salt is kosher, and that is not what kosher salt means. Kosher salt is a type of salt of a certain grain size that has certain kernels of salt that are a certain size. That was the size used when we used to salt our meat to withdraw the blood at home. Nowadays, almost all kosher meat has already gone through that process at the butcher, and so you don't need to do that at home, and thus we don't use kosher salt as a regular practice. But it is about the size of the salt, not the substance of the salt. All salt is perfectly fine unless someone has added some weird flavoring to it. And part 5, meat and milk, while fine on their own, meaning steak is okay and a glass of milk is okay, but not together for the same meal. Milk and meat do not belong together at the same meal. So those are the basic rules of kashrut. And as you can see, it is not overly complicated or hard to remember. There are some details involving how we handle our items, our plates, our utensils, and some specifics of things that are or are not allowed that we will go into. But this is the general framework. Now, this means that we're going to focus on sort of the bundles of mitzvot in order to divide up our time more usefully. So we're going to look at what are the kosher species, meaning what plants, bugs, fish, birds, and animals are allowed. And we're also going to look at how to kill plant, bug, fish, or bird, or animal for tonight's class. We are going to look at how you prepare the food and how you cook the food in much more detail next week. So let's talk about a general framework of species. Judaism essentially looks at species as being nearer or further from being human-like. So you can see in our circle here at the bottom, the humans, of which there is a smaller group, globally speaking, than anything else. And as we move out, we'll see that animals, things that are walking around in the world with us, do tend to seem more similar to us if they are a dog, a bear, a cow, or a sheep, than if they were a fowl, than if they were a bird. Those animals are not quite as human-like and as easy to relate to, if you will. And that's followed up by more distant yet fish and insects, which seem to be almost completely separate from our existence and experiences. And what is almost impossible for us to relate to, of course, are plants and minerals. And you'll see that the further we get from humanity, the easier it is to eat something. The less restrictions there are, the fewer restrictions there are on what we can eat, and the fewer steps in preparation for making them into food. So there is a direct correlation. The more similar it is to humans, the more likely it is that it'll be harder to prepare, and fewer examples of that category will be available for our consumption. This goes back to the whole idea that as we guide how we are consuming the world, we are being taught over and over that among the most cherished things in life is human life, and that should never be consumed, not physically, not spiritually, not socially. And we remind ourselves of that by making sure that as we draw closer and closer to things that remind us of people, we are even more and more careful about how we are treating them. So let's talk about that which is most universally allowed, because it is that which is most distant from us. Plants. From Genesis 1:29, God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food." That is for everyone, and it was never updated by any later kosher law. Every plant is fine. Go crazy when you're in the supermarket vegetable and fruit section. Everything there is kosher. Whether you like Brussels sprouts or not, they are kosher. Whether you like papaya or not, it is kosher. All plants, then, are kosher by themselves. However, when it comes time to purchase them, if you see that they have been prepared by someone else, if they have added any additional ingredients beyond just salt for a preservative, then we do need more investigation. And we'll talk about how to double check things to make sure they are kosher if they've been processed to a different degree. So basically, the basic rule is if you're picking up a fresh piece of fruit or plant, you're perfectly fine. If it's been processed, but just meaning picked, cut, and thrown into a bag and thrown into the freezer section, then you're almost certainly fine. And most tinned fruits and vegetables are also fine. But if other things have been added, then we can talk. Bugs. And yes, there are such things as kosher bugs. God says to us, "You shall not eat among all the things that swarm upon the earth, anything that crawls on its belly, or anything that walks on fours, or anything that has many legs, for they are an abomination." The phrase toeva, abomination, is a general term that's used in the biblical text to mean anything that is beyond even consideration, something that should not be even touched. The English word abomination has many different meanings in modern English, but just in general, it is beyond consideration would probably be the easiest way to capture its feeling. So, as you can see, most bugs and other animals, for that matter, that are running around the earth are off the table. However, from Vayikra 11, "But these you may eat among all the winged swarming things that walk on four, all that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground. Of these you may eat the following: locusts of every variety, all varieties of bald locust, crickets of every variety, and all varieties of grasshopper." Now, the specific identity of all the different species is something that most of us are not expert on. The European community long ago stopped eating the bugs, and even many of the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities stopped eating them a while ago. But there are some experts that do know exactly which ones are kosher, and they are technically kosher. And it is not an issue of preparation. If you grab a grasshopper and you know it's a kosher one, you can eat it. There's nothing else that needs to be done. Someone asked in the chat about the idea of a non-Jew opening up a bottle of wine, of whether that means it is not kosher anymore. So the short answer is that is not about kashrut specifically. That is about idolatry. In the ancient world, wine was used in the religious ceremonies of almost every idol worshiping community or nation. And as such, there was a deep suspicion borne out by constant experience that idolaters would often take bottles of wine and say blessings over it, dedicating it for whatever god they were worshiping. As such, it became Jewish practice not to allow a non-Jew to handle, and especially handle, an open bottle of wine, because they might be saying their invocations of their idol over it. In the modern world, in the conservative movement, where we are not surrounded by idol worshippers and we are not surrounded by people that would behave in such a way, in the conservative movement, we do not have a problem with a non-Jew touching a bottle of wine. However, you will find that most Orthodox do continue this distinction despite the distinct lack of idolatry in the world around us. But it's technically not about the kashrut of the wine. It is about the fear of idolatry. Fish. Moving closer, fish, there are some limits. These you may eat of all that live in the water, anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams, that has fins and scales. These you may eat. Scales mean not just bumpy skin, but actual scales that will flake off. This is why, for example, shark is not kosher, because although a shark's skin certainly has a texture to it, it does not have those detachable scales that are so distinctive on true fish. But anything in the sea or in the streams that has no fins or scales, among all the swarming things of the water and among all the other living creatures that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. Again, they are off limits. So things like shark or shellfish like oysters, shrimp, lobsters, clams, octopus, things like catfish, these all do not have either fins or scales, or in many of those cases, neither of them. And that means that they are not kosher. As somebody who grew up not keeping kosher and grew up in San Diego, which is a seaside town, I will say that it was much harder to give up clams, oysters, shrimp, and all of these things than it was for me to give up pork. Pork I could care less about, but yeah, I can certainly say that giving up all of the seafood was much harder. But I have been repaid in multiple ways in the decades since I gave them up, and I have no interest in trying them again. Moving on to things that are even more similar to us, the birds of the air. As I said, there is a list. The following you shall abominate among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, and the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, all varieties of raven, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, and the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, and the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hoopoe, and the bat. Now, I could not identify most of those from the English, and there is a great deal of debate about the Hebrew and whether or not the terms that are being described are still applicable to every variety of bird. So there is a debate about the identity of some of these words, and there has been for a few thousand years. That means that we eat birds nowadays that we are definitely sure are not on the list. And to be definite, most will ensure that they only eat birds that are already being eaten by Jewish people, meaning that there is a custom and tradition that we can rely upon to know that these are birds that are not on this list. Hopefully, you've also learned, as we've gone through these species so far, that even though we've used the word abomination or abominate, that does not mean there's anything wrong with these particular animals. The animals such as hawk and eagle are often looked upon very favorably in biblical poetry. Certainly, there is nothing wrong with the things in the ocean that are not fish, and that there is nothing that is inherently bad about any of these particular creatures. They are simply not kosher. Which brings us to the animals that are most like us and in which we are most restricted. These are the creatures that you may eat from among all the land animals. Any animal that has true hoofs, with clefts through the hoofs, and that chews the cud, such you may eat. That means, for practical purposes, cows and sheep. But to be fair, there are some other animals as well, such as deer and even giraffe, that also meet these criteria. But you're not going to find deer and giraffe on the menu for many of our kosher restaurants. But beef and lamb are going to be quite common. But other animals, pigs, camels, horses, dogs, rabbits, cats, squirrels, guinea pigs, and most other types of animals that people eat that are not on the left-hand side, those are not kosher because they do not have split hooves all the way through, and or they do not chew their cud. We do get a few that have one symbol, one sign, but not all. For example, camels chew their cud, but they do not have cleft hooves. Pigs have cleft hooves, but they do not chew their cud. But you need to have both, or else you're not kosher. Now that completes the general overview of what an animal has to be to start with, meaning it to at least even be in the running to become dinner. However, just because the animal is kosher, a cow or a sheep or a chicken, that doesn't mean that the animal will necessarily end up on my plate. There are a number of things that can go wrong that would make the animal not fit for me to eat. For example, you shall be holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. That is to say, if something that is considered treif, literally meaning torn, although later becoming meaning just not kosher in general, if something is treif, if it has been attacked by a lion or a wolf, even if it is still alive by the time you slaughter it, it is still not fit to be eaten. However, you can feed the body of that animal when it dies to your dogs. Likewise, there is what we call a nevela. You shall not eat anything that has died a natural death. Give it to the stranger in your community to eat, or you may sell it to a foreigner. So this natural death just means the animal got sick and died. And if such a thing happens, we are not allowed to eat the body of the animal after its natural death, but we can still sell it or use it in some other ways than food. And then finally, we get the more general instructions. If the place where the Lord has chosen to establish his name is too far for you, you may slaughter any of the cattle or sheep that your Lord gives you, as I have instructed you, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements. So as we talked about in our class about Jewish text, this is one of the places where we are reminded that there is an oral Torah. Indeed, as I have instructed you is not made explicit anywhere in the Torah itself, nor really could it be, given that the details of shchita, of slaughter, need to be seen on an animal to truly be appreciated and performed correctly. You can't really learn it entirely from a book, although you can get a lot from that book. But as you can see, there is a particular way that an animal needs to be slaughtered. God expects us to slaughter the animal in a very particular way. And that means if the animal is slaughtered differently, then the animal is not kosher. Even if it is a cow, even if it is dying because I'm doing it, it wasn't hit by a bear, it wasn't dying a natural death, it's me that's taking the life. If I mess up that process, then I still cannot eat that body. So there are a number of different ways that it can go wrong. And this is a few examples of how it must be done in order to prevent them. There are 5 halakhic requirements the shochet, the butcher, the slaughterer, is obliged to ensure in the performance of shchita, the act of kosher slaughter. 1, there should be no interruption in the incision. Right? That means there should not be a shehiyah, a pause, which means when the slice happens, it needs to be one motion, not half and then half again. There should be no pressing of the chalaf, the knife, against the neck. That would be considered darasa. This would exclude the use of an axe, a hatchet, or guillotine. The actual slice has to be a slicing motion, not a pushing motion against the animal's neck. 3, the chalaf, the knife, should not be covered by the hide of the cattle, wool or of sheep, or feathers of the birds, which would be a chalada, like an intrusion between the cut, and therefore the chalaf must be of adequate length, meaning you need a thicker and longer knife to be able to slaughter a larger animal than a smaller one. 4, the incision must be at the appropriate site to sever the major structures and vessels at the neck. If you don't do that, it's called hagrama. In fact, this is something we began talking about in last night's Mishnah class. It's through the trachea right here that the slaughtering must be done. And there must be no tearing of the vessels before or during the shlita process. That would be called ikur, meaning that if you were to catch it with the point of the knife and poke it rather than, or tear it, rather than doing the proper slice with the edge, then the animal would become not kosher. The meat would not be fit for food. Now, I'm not expecting you to remember all of these. Thankfully, we live in a day and age when most of us do not need to pick up the knife to slaughter our own meat. But just recognize that when the slaughter was being done on our behalf, that these are the different requirements that are being met in order to ensure that the slaughter is indeed kosher. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you really would like to learn more about this and are ready to dive in, join me on Wednesdays for our Chulin class, Mishnah class in Chulin, where we can learn about this in much more detail. As we have mentioned numerous times already, there is a prohibition on eating the blood. Here taken from Leviticus 7, you must not consume any blood, either of bird or of animal in any of your settlements, meaning anywhere you live. Anyone who eats blood shall be cut off from his kin. But this is not only in Leviticus 7, it's also in Genesis 9, Leviticus 17, and Deuteronomy 12. Clearly, this is important, which means that once you have slaughtered the animal, you also have to prepare it further. So even if you did the proper slicing and every way of a proper animal that was actually kosher, you still need to do what's next, or else the animal isn't kosher. So all the large blood vessels, the larger veins, arteries, and things like that are removed after the blood has been drained out of the animal. And the meat is then salted, as I talked about before with kosher salt, and soaked to remove the rest. The salt absorbs the blood, and then the soaking will allow you to wash it off, and then the process is repeated to draw the blood out of the meat. It is also possible to broil the meat to cause the blood to bubble from within and pop out of the meat. And then the meat is washed at that point as well to allow it to continue to broil and bubble out. And that would also make the meat kosher by removing the blood that is in it. Once again, in the modern world, this is done by all of the regular slaughterhouses so that we do not need to do this on our own. But even as recently as the mid to late 20th century, this was still being done by most Jewish people. They would go to the butcher, back in the day when you had a butcher, not a supermarket, and you would buy your meat, you would bring it home, and you would do the salting and washing to draw out the blood. Now, as I mentioned before, and we will go into more detail next week as well, we are not allowed to mix meat and milk. Indeed, it is said 3 different places in the Torah, you shall not boil a kid, which is the word for young goat, in its mother's milk. Now, the word kid, as Shulchan Aruch tells us here, is not specific, meaning this is not only you're not allowed to have the meat of a kid in milk. It is the same rule with ox, sheep, and goat. There is no difference if it is the milk of the mother in particular or of another domesticated animal. Rather, the verse refers to the common case. So what this means is no cheeseburger, right? Even if you have kosher meat and you have kosher cheese, meaning it came from a kosher animal, which 99% of the cheese in America does, you cannot put them together. And in fact, if you add kosher cheese and kosher meat, then you would be uniquely violating this rule by mixing them together. It means that you cannot have a milkshake with your steak dinner. It means that you have to be, as we'll talk much more next week, very careful in the implements used to cook meat and milk. But this is the general rule. And as you can see here, already there is an implication and a spiritual insight into cultivating that kindness and compassion, that to imagine that we are taking the meat of an animal and we are cooking it in the milk of a mother, even if it's not the specifics, the specific language of the poetry of this mitzvah is trying to remind us that in and of itself would really be a very callous act. To use something that is destined for life together with a life that has been taken is very much in poor taste, pardon the pun. And that by avoiding the mixing of meat and milk, we are avoiding that callous and cruel act. I see the chat has got me a couple other questions. Do we have a shochet in Central Florida? So there are kosher butchers in Central Florida, but not a lot. There's one near Tampa, and I believe there's one up in the Daytona area, but I haven't confirmed that for myself. There are many more down in South Florida. However, most of the time, most people are not going to the shochet. That is to say, they're not going to the person that kills the animal in the first place. That is mostly done in the middle of America. Specifically, Iowa is the biggest area because that is where all of the cows are brought that are being raised by any farm in that whole section of the country. So the kosher butchers will buy cows from whoever was raising them, and then they will make sure that the cow is prepared and butchered properly. So by the time it gets to us, it is already wrapped in cellophane and has been properly prepared. But that does mean that you are at the mercy of what is available in the local supermarket, and you do not have the luxury of talking to the butcher and ordering something special or having a particular size cut prepared just for you. For that, you have to go to a very large Jewish community. Like I said, you can find some in South Florida and then in the Northeast. Los Angeles has them as well. It's one of the things I miss from living in Los Angeles and Baltimore was the great butchers. But thankfully, we do have enough kosher support in Central Florida that you can at least find kosher meat in some supermarkets. And that is a very big plus because there are many parts of the US where finding kosher meat in a supermarket is next to impossible unless we're talking kosher hot dogs. And that means you will have to either order it or drive hours and hours with a cooler, stock up a few times each year, and have a freezer at home that you can put the meat in to keep it until you are ready. Or Central Florida, Orlando in particular, is better than some parts of the country and not quite as good as others with regards to access for kosher meat. I'll put in my common plug. The supermarket in our area that has the best selection of kosher meat is the Winn-Dixie in Fern Park, which is just off the 1792, just south of the 436. It's if you were going between Temple Israel and the JCC, it's right along the way. And that is where you can find the best selection here. In fact, they just expanded their kosher department, and they've got a pretty good supply. Been looking for chicken breasts for a while, and they've been out, but we can usually find most of what we need when we go there. You may have also heard that we don't eat meat and milk, and we don't eat chicken and milk or other types of bird and milk. Indeed, as Rambam points out, it is forbidden to partake of poultry and milk according to rabbinic law, meaning that the Torah did not prohibit it, but the rabbis felt that there needed to be an extra precaution. Why? So that people at large will not be negligent and come to violate the scriptural prohibition. This is a standard practice for many different parts where if there is a real risk, if people are accustomed to doing something, and if that something is very similar to something that is forbidden, then the rabbis will often make the permitted forbidden in order that we don't violate the real forbidden. Now, I have heard enough people over my years complain, yes, but Rabbi, is it really likely that I'm going to mix up my chicken for my beef? Is it really a problem? And the short answer is no. Chicken and milk and beef are pretty easy to tell what's what. However, that is not what has been the norm for most of our history, right? Yes, steak and chicken, very, very simple. But for most of our history, this is what our meat has looked like, whether it comes from a bird or whether it comes from an animal. We have here an example of duck, and we have an example of lamb. And I'm pretty sure that most of you would be able to make a guess of which one is lamb and which one is duck. But I make you a bet that none of you would want to make a bet. Meaning, if I asked you to put $100 on your estimation, you probably wouldn't be 100% sure. And then if I said, okay, and then I'm going to cook them, and in much the same way, and then you will have to look at them in their cooked state, maybe in a stew, maybe covered in a sauce, you would be even less certain about which was which. It is very easy to mix up most birds with most meat. Chicken is a bit of a outlier with its very, very, very light-skinned meat. And that gives people a false sense of confidence. So we do prevent the mixing of poultry with dairy. I will say that if you are in the process of becoming kosher, that is to say, learning the rules of keeping kosher, whether you were born Jewish and are coming to it later, like I did when I was young, or whether you are somebody that is converting and are trying on Kashrut for the first time, if you are currently having a mental crisis about the meat and poultry mix-up, okay, take the first step and just avoid mixing obvious mammals with milk. And don't worry about preventing any mix-up with chicken just right now. I am confident that over time, as you practice keeping kosher and as it becomes more natural and you find that spiritual benefit from it, you will eventually come to also separate the chicken from the dairy as well. I can tell you that from personal experience. But don't let it be a stumbling block right now if you are just on the steps to learning. If it takes that transition period where you're allowing yourself to eat meat, poultry and milk, by all means. Likewise, for any of the different things that we have talked about tonight. If you are willing to give up pork, but you're not willing to only buy properly slaughtered beef, that is still better than eating pork as well. If you are willing to give up pork, but not willing to give up lobster just yet, that is still better than not giving up pork at all. Each of the different mitzvot, indeed, each of the moments we sit down to eat, is a new opportunity and a new chance for that spiritual activity. And that means that what you do on day one is not necessarily going to be what you do on day two. What you do for breakfast may not be what you do for dinner. And keeping kashrut to any degree at any time is always better than nothing. And you do not need to worry about being called a hypocrite or being called somebody that is, a sinner. You are learning, adjusting, and you are growing. And that is what we are hoping for. Eventually, you'll get there. And eventually, you will come to feel and understand the deepness and richness of keeping kosher. But for now, don't be hard on yourself. Don't push yourself too hard. Again, from personal experience, it took me a couple years before I was fully adjusted into keeping kosher. And it had different increases and plateaus when I got used to things, and then increases again. There is no right or wrong way to get used to it. Each person is different. If you're having trouble or want advice on your personal situation, we can talk individually. Again, if you have it mixed up, it's even harder to tell. Now, the other thing I want to leave you with tonight is the idea of what is called a Hechsher. A Hechsher is a stamp, a symbol, a logo that lets you know that the food you are about to eat has already been checked to make sure it's kosher. Like I mentioned, it's very easy if you are picking up a carrot, something that is fresh produce. If it's been processed, it's much harder. We are not close to the way our food is made. We are not there when it is ground up, when it is cooked, when it is mixed. And that means we often don't know what has been used in that process. Even our packaging is not obligated to tell us every ingredient. And that means there is a lot of doubt involved in the manufacturing for those of us that keep kosher. That means we have to rely on someone else to supervise, to go, to check the factory, to check the restaurant, to check wherever it's being made, to make sure that it is indeed kosher. That is what we mean when we say a Hechsher, a stamp. These symbols are the most common symbols here in the United States. There are other ones from different organizations and supervisory groups around the world. If you see one of these on a product, you will know that it is kosher. There are a few others as well, most notably Triangle K, which is acceptable. Some people argue about it, but really there is no reason to not accept it except for politics. And yes, there are politics around all of this. But if you see these symbols, then you'll know that processed food is kosher. So next time you're in the supermarket and you're picking up a pack of potato chips, or you want to buy Oreos, look on the container and you'll see one of these symbols somewhere on the front or near the ingredients, and you'll know that indeed this is kosher. I find it very funny, very ironic that the vast majority of Americans eat a lot of kosher food every single day without even knowing it. And that is a wonderful plus in this particular part of our history, that so much there is so much food richness and variety, and so much of it is available as kosher. And if one product or one brand of a product is not labeled as kosher, look on that shelf. I can almost guarantee that as long as it's not the bacon, there is somebody that makes a kosher variety of it. And even bacon, there are kosher varieties, but that's a whole nother story. And it's not from a pig. All right, everyone, we're going to have to leave it there. As I mentioned, I have another meeting to attend. Thank you all so much. We will, again, not be having our class next Wednesday and Thursday night because of the Shiva for my family. So we will meet again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone. And